Welcome back to Story University Lesson 7. What is the best way to finance your corporate real estate? I'm Chris Volk, CEO of Store Capital, and in the first two parts of this lesson, we created a financial model to illustrate the differences between leasing and owning real estate. In that model, we showed that given our assumptions, real estate leasing appears to offer the better ability to create shareholder value. Corporate free cash flow was about the same. Leasing conserves YAM and makes a strong use of OPM, which means that leasing offers substantially higher pre-tax rates of return on equity, 85% versus 37.9%, and therefore superior shareholder returns and rates of wealth creation. But guess what? To add a small measure of insult to injury, your cash equity rate of return is even slightly less with the ownership decision. That's because the loan you have is at 6%, but the amortization over 20 years raises the payment constant to 8.6%. which in this example is slightly higher than the lease rate you could have had. Remember, a payment constant is simply your total payment divided into the amount of proceeds received. The impact is that your cash-on-cash pre-tax return on equity falls to 33.85%. As an aside, it's interesting to note here that this illustration shows that ownership and your large equity commitments to the real estate do not alone lower corporate investment risk. That's because contractual payment obligation is nearly the same in either case, which is 8.5% in the case of leasing and 8.6% in the case of owning. You might note that your 30% ownership equity will still mean that you have a lower payment, even though the payment constants are similar. Likewise, you might say that the 37.9% pre-tax rate of return may be less than the 85% current pre-tax rate of return from leasing, but it's on a larger equity investment. True, so let's do some math. First, assume that the business, investment, and return requirements from shareholders are about identical, regardless of whether you elect to lease or own. In such a case, the equity return requirement for leasing option is $212,000, while the equity requirement for the ownership option is materially more at $635,000. Dividing your current pre-tax equity rates of return by the rates of return acceptable to other investors will get you a multiple of your initial equity value. In this case, not only is the rate of return from leasing higher on line 5, but so is the actual equity gain on line 8. Now, one more thought is this. Owning the real estate in our example requires an added equity commitment of $424,000. Most investors would prefer to conserve this money to invest in corporate growth. After all, this money represents precisely the equity requirements that you would need for 2 more lease locations, which means that you would have the ability to create an added equity gain from those 2 locations of nearly $1.4 million. So now leasing becomes a no-brainer because you're comparing about $2.1 million in equity gains from leasing 3 locations to just the $569,000 gain from the operation of a single location. But let's say you don't have this opportunity to grow, and let's say that you have no idea what you would do with an extra $424,000. We see companies like this from time to time, and for them, real estate ownership is often the choice. A final thought. You might argue that my analysis excludes any consideration of the appreciation on the real estate that you're foregoing. So your business equity rates of return may be less if you own the real estate, but you might be due for a pop in real estate value, which I neglected to include. To address this, I have a couple of thoughts. The first is that it would take a massive amount of real estate appreciation to make up for the more than 40% in added annual pre-tax cash-on-cash returns that the lease solution offers. I've been financing real estate for decades, and I've never seen real estate compound annual rates of return anything close to this exciting. Second, if you have a lease having 1.5% annual lease escalators, as in our model, you've basically capped the amount of value available to the landlord to that rate of growth. Any landlord selling an asset will have to sell it subject to their lease with you. It is possible that there is cap rate compression, which means to say that a landlord sells your 8.5% lease to someone happy to make 7.5%. But the lease escalators, together with your ability to control the asset for a long period of time, will mean that the landlord has no ability to sell the property to any buyer looking for a higher and better use. Your landlord, thinking of such a possibility, would first have to make an offer to buy you out of your lease to vacate the premises, which means that you'd likely participate in the higher real estate valuation anyway, without even ever having owned the property. Finally, you might be thinking that real estate ownership may have certain tax benefits, since you can depreciate the real estate. To this, I would note that you can't depreciate land, and that the buildings are today depreciable over 39.5 years, which is hardly a windfall. Moreover, depreciation is more like a tax deferral than a permanent tax avoidance, since it's ultimately recaptured upon any asset sale. To recap, when it comes to lost real estate appreciation or any real estate tax benefits, my opinion is it's not even worth thinking about these unless the disparities between leasing and owning are far closer than the illustration that we've created. In our example, we're talking about a roughly 40% pre-tax compound annual return spread, and you just can't beat that. In our next lesson, we'll explore what happens when you take a look at the return differences of your capitalization alternatives over multiple years, and then examine the importance of qualitative issues. Until then, I'm Volk, thanking you for joining me on this value creation journey.